Okay, well, here we go. It's Sunday, April 5th, 2020. We're in the middle of the pandemic. And my name is John Foy, and I will be reading right now from my new manuscript. It's a book called It Is What It Is. It won the 2020 Donald Justice Poetry Prize and was selected by the poet J. Allen Rosser, to whom I'm very grateful. And it will be published next year by Autumn House Press. I'd like to thank too Jesse Waters, the coordinator, the director of the Westchester Poetry Conference, and his team, who have helped me set this up technically, and my wife helped me get set up on Zoom. It's a bit daunting for me. I'm not tech savvy or camera ready, so I'm really just making shift right now. So please bear with me. We are in New York City. My wife and I live up in Morningside Heights near Columbia University in Barnard, and we're okay. Our two kids are okay. Our son is up at McGill in Montreal, and our daughter is down in Richmond, Virginia, working remotely. And I'm hoping that you too are okay in these troubled times, you and your loved ones and friends. So a lot of the poems in my new book are rather dark and depressing, and I realize this is not the time for that sort of thing. So I'm going to stick with poems that are a little more upbeat and playful. I'll read for about 10 minutes. I've got to get the poems up on the screen here. Okay. So this poem is called Funeral, and it's really about words that rhyme or almost rhyme. And in the tribe of formal poets, these disputes can be a big deal. No word really rhymes with funeral. There are, though, some that almost rhyme, like useful, futile, irretrievable. And then there's tuna casserole, but that's a stretch, and urinal is inappropriate. I do like brutal, crucial, cruel, and doable. And what's wrong with denial? The director of a funeral home told me I would leave this mortal life. He was beyond contemptible. But that was long ago when my father died. He sold us bogus death certificates that were, for legal purposes, not usable. His cufflinks were incomparable. This poem refers to the famous sculpture by Rodin called The Thinker. The Stinker. Although it's all the rage to question now a common human nature, let's concede at least a brotherhood that's based on how each one conforms and does the daily deed. Like everyone, the democratic man assumes that old ancestral pose ennobled by Rodin, whose thinking man conflates the art of thought and the repose of one attending nature's dividends. Hobbled by urges rude and execrable, the body in allegiance has to bend, but won't forsake the form of the ideal, a posture of the highest in the base, that man might lose his load, but not his face. And this is the book's title poem. It rings the changes on an adage that we're all very familiar with right now. It is what it is. It's not what it might have been. It's not what it had been. It isn't what it could be. It's not what it ought to be. It won't be what it might have been. It was what it ought not to have been. It will be what it ought not to be. It ought not to be what it is. It's surely not what it was. It can't ever be what it had been. It'll never be what it could have been. It ought never to have been what it had been. It was what it was. It's not what it was. It is what it is. Okay, so in New York City, there's a museum called the Museum of Sex. And for those who are interested, it's at 233 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. And I've written a series of 14 sonnets about this museum. And I'd like to read maybe just 4 of them right now. I won't cite the numbers, I'll just read each one in sequence, and I think they'll hang together and make sense. The Museum of Sex. I'd like to go, but who would go with me? Not everyone, of course, is up for this. My wife has called it a redundancy and said that I should go with David Katz, my poet friend. But David's not inclined to visit such a place, just him and me. Would there be dioramas there, like the kind at the American Museum of Natural History? To go alone would be unthinkable. How sad to wander through the galleries, inspecting things that don't seem doable. A group is probably best, a coterie of 7 poets, not so free from sin. I wonder if they'd even let us in. My wife at last agreed to go with me, and I was glad. She knew that I had planned to try and conjure up some poetry, erotic and obscene. I'd try my hand. Much wiser now, and having sown our oats, we wouldn't feel ashamed at being there. But then she asked if I'd be taking notes. This gave me pause. I do admit I care about appearances. So how could I take notes in a museum such as this without a fear that one might ask me why? These things, for me, aren't easy to dismiss. But then my wife suggested, good for her, that folks would likely say, oh, look, a scholar. And this is about after having been to the museum. A major disappointment, this. I'd hoped to see outrageous paintings on display or installations with machines and ropes and groups of tantric acrobats at play. You know, the brave transgression of performance art. There wasn't anything about frottage, no enemas, and nothing on the squirt, not even an exhibit on massage. There was the kinesthetic camping ground, 1,000 years of Chinese imagery, and something called a self-pleasuring tent. But 3 copulating elk? That took the crown and undermined a bit one's dignity. Although I guess I'm glad to say I went. All right, I'm just scrolling down to the next one in the sequence. Majot, my wife, was underwhelmed. The place was funny, yes. Sophisticated, no. Venetians knew about erotic grace, like Titian, Veronese, Tintoretto. Suggestion was the beauty of their art. But here, the animals were a surprise, those bonobos, the rhino's private part. Everything was right before our eyes. That Asian couple showed up once again, I don't know how, inside a room with us. They looked our way, and we too looked at them. And then we got out quick, all 4 of us. Nothing there was warm or intimate. My wife said this, and I agreed with it. Okay, I'll read 2 more poems. Let me scroll down to the next one. This next poem is a formal poem in the most rudimentary sense, in the way that a list is sort of a primitive kind of form. So let me get down there. Here we go. Unlocking the incredible power of small stones. The 7 habits of highly effective people. The 8 Traits of Likeable Folk. How to Live Authentically in Cleveland. Here we go, coming to terms with self-immolation. My lifelong struggle with Sambuca. A Grifter's Guide to Penn Station. Come Home, Pappy, The Lost Years in South Dakota. The Book of Neuroplasticity for Homeless Men. I'm Albanian, how about you? Grandma's Cup of Quarters, Growing Old in Vegas. The Wisdom of the Unemployed. How to Talk to Very Young Women in Brooklyn. Burmese Meditation for Alcoholics. You've got Crohn's disease, now what? 300 Ways to Lose Your Job. How not to fall in with harlots and fornicators. St. Anthony and the Hermeneutics of Masturbation. Ringo Starr's Big Book of Bright Beads. Al Sharpton and the Kama Sutra, The End of History. Donald Trump and the Kama Sutra, The Rebirth of Tragedy. Digital Rectal Exam, Techniques, Insights, and Epiphanies. How to Manage Your Feelings During Wartime. A Young Woman's Guide to Gels and Ointments. Take It from Gumby, Life Without a Penis. The 98 Most Dreadful Ways to Die. Smegma, the Medical Dictionary for Young Boys. Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Bolivians. Climbing Mount Everest at 95, a short story of hope and personal tragedy. Why do small Korean gymnasts have to die? Enemas and eremites, colon cleansing in the early Christian church. How to Start Your Own Funeral Home. A Year in Lithuania, My Life as a Sexual Acrobat. How to Get Along with Others in a Federal Penitentiary. Spanky's Guide to End-of-Life Decisions. Unlocking the Incredible Power of Small Stones. Okay, I will conclude with a poem that requires just a brief introduction. It's a New York City poem, and let me scroll down to it. Almost there. Here we go. I'm almost there. Here we are. Okay, so in Midtown Manhattan, on Fifth Avenue, if you find yourself in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral, you'll see that when the doors of the cathedral are open, for instance, after Mass, you can look right down the central aisle into the towards the altar and see Christ on the cross above the altar. And then, if you turn around and look directly across to the other side, the west side of Fifth Avenue, you're facing Rockefeller Center and you see the sculpture of Atlas holding up the world. And my sense is that this alignment was done intentionally. When the doors of the cathedral are open, it seems as though Christ on the cross and Atlas holding up his sphere are looking at each other, each with their own burden. And that's the central image of this poem. It's called Cross and Sphere. Of course, they'll never meet, but there they are. Jesus on the east side crucified, and Atlas on the west side leaning in. Each one reconciled by now, we hope, not only to his awful punishment, but to facing off across Fifth Avenue, halfway down the block from 51st. Both have graduated from the School of Universal Treachery and Pain and find themselves in mid-Manhattan now. Deep inside St. Patrick's, like a jewel, Jesus hangs professionally on the cross. And when the giant front doors open up, you can see the Son of Man above the throng of Japanese and widowers from the Bronx and matrons in a flush of godliness. Right across the street, in a perfect line, is mighty Atlas, lost in his own world and looking like Mussolini, just a tad, but shouldering the heavens like a man with a second mortgage and child support to pay. He cannot fail. He's almost falling off his pedestal, or is he climbing up? His eyes are hard and empty like a bird's, bereft of individuality. So what he thinks of Christ across the way is anybody's guess. A reprobate? Another bleeder in the pantheon? And what goes through the mind of Jesus Christ sorrowing down that long cathedral aisle? He's dwarfed a bit by all the opulence. Each of them is far too occupied with his own travails to care too much about the one who suffers in proximity. The least that we can do now is to pause. We played them false a long time ago. And think about their brands, the cross and sphere. We cannot really say that they compete, though Christ the carpenter, upon his wood, has surely taken market share away from Atlas of the Titanomachy. Laboring over there on the west side, holding up the sky, for what, the birds? Atlas cannot ever be redeemed, and if he prays at all, he prays to be beyond instead of under everything. So, thank you. That's it. I hope that everyone is safe and stays well, and it'll be good to all be back together again in person at the Westchester Poetry Conference next year. And in the meantime, yeah, stay well, and thanks again.